I'm going to start with our professor of the evening here. Daniel Payne is, he's the official family authorized Henry Beston biographer. And he's been coming to Bowdoin in the summers and pouring through stacks of Henry Beston papers and letters and visiting the farm, and he's working on what in 20 or 30 years will be the biography of Henry Beston. Daniel spent last summer, Henry made a pledge to Elizabeth that he was going to write her a love letter a day until she married him. And I think she held out for about a year. And Henry was true to his word. Henry was true to his word and wrote a letter every day. And Daniel spent a couple weeks last summer down in Brunswick reading all of those letters. We're not going to read them all to you tonight. And so Daniel is now up to the point, I think, where they finally just bought Chimney Farm.
Finally.
And that's sort of where Dick comes in, because they wouldn't have come to Chimney Farm and bought Chimney Farm without the influence of Dick's dad. And Patty was there as a child when her dad was hanging out with Henry and brought a picture, I think, of Henry at your wedding, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to start with this panel and then have a couple other people, and I hope and I encourage you to join in. So this is Daniel Payne, who teaches at State University of New York in Oneonta, and he's currently obsessed with her. He's trying to write this biography of Henry Beston, so I'll let him. Can I?
And
No.
Gary
Nobleborough.
Nobleborough. Well, Nobleborough.
You've made a mistake already.
Yeah, I know. Well, Gary's making fun about me going over all those letters, but it was no joking matter. It was driving me crazy. But on the other hand, as a biographer, it's an embarrassment of riches, and it is wonderful to have all of these written records left. Thank God for Elizabeth, who saved everything. And I sometimes feel bad for future biographers who are going to have none of this type of record left, because we all do telephones and emails, and that type of material won't be around anymore, unfortunately.
What year was that the letters began and ended?
The love letters, it began 1928, but 1920, or just before their marriage in 1929. They get married in June of 29, and for at least 6 months, there was a letter every day, or pretty much. And the other thing is that they're beautiful letters. I mean, people don't write love letters like this anymore. They're absolutely gorgeous letters. So, the question for me was, why on earth would Henry Beston move to Maine? Not because Maine isn't beautiful. I can see, the obvious answer to that is, well, who wouldn't move to Maine? Especially if you're from Massachusetts. Everybody moves to Maine from Massachusetts, it seems. But he had just come out with The Outermost House, his book on Cape Cod. It was a huge success. He was making follow-up plans to write a book about the Inner Cape. And he was well along in that process, or at least he claimed to be well along in that process in his communications with his publisher. Part of the reason, I think, why he moves up to Maine is because he had become, during his year on Cape Cod, become more and more convinced that modern industrial society was sick to its thin blood, that there was not enough. We had, as people, had moved away from nature in a very, very unhealthy way. The rhythms of nature were extremely important to him, he believed, as part of our spiritual heritage. And after his year on Cape Cod, where he becomes very convinced that this is the case, he moves to Hingham, which is essentially a suburb. Now I'm not even sure to call it a suburb, part of the great exurb there. But he is extremely unhappy with living in a suburb, and it seems that he had a very difficult time making any headway on the next book, the book about the Inner Cape. He was just not finding the same inspiration to write about nature while he was living in Hingham in the suburbs that he had felt in the Outer Cape. And I think one of the main reasons why he ends up moving is that he was looking for some place where he could find the same spiritual inspiration, literary inspiration that he had experienced on the Cape. Okay, so that's what he was looking for, but why did he end up here in Nobleborough? Why here? And I think the short answer to that question, and probably the most accurate, is he moved here because of the Days. He was very close to Jake and B. Day. He had, starting, I think in 1929, 1930, had started coming up here on a fairly regular basis to visit with the family. And some of the letters that I have gone through concerning the first year or so after they move here and the period just before they moved are really interesting. And since this was an evening of stories, I figured I would just copy some of the letters. Here is one from March 1931 that he writes to Elizabeth, who is back in Hingham. A gray storm accompanied me all the way to Maine, gathering round me in a thick whirl when I dropped off at Newcastle, Damariscotta. And getting to Jake's was a plunge through huge drifts new whitened. The snow is very deep here, real snowshoe depth, and the evergreens are a show of close-packed pyramids with drooping branches. Today there's less sunlight, than a sense of it as the great cloud mass grows vaporous and vaguely closes and opens, illuminating one's dooryard now this far field. Jake's studio on the hill, a quarter to a half mile away, emerges like a fairy tale house from its pines. And those of you who know Henry Beston's work know that he was a children's author as well and loved fairy tales, so this would be a very appealing image for him. Jake is not working at the studio in this heavy snow, but uses a bedroom. Dickie is a darling. I had time to stop in Boston at a sporting goods store and buy them both pedometers, which click-tock as they wear them, and measure the miles they walk. Mac, too, is a blessed kid. Mac, who looks like Jake, has much of B. Dickie, who is B all over, is Jake mentally through and through. The Day's Ark address is the boat riding paper, just Damariscotta for me, care of Maurice Day. And then he goes on to tell about how Jake's family was boat builders, and every time one of his grandfather's boats would come in, they would throw a big dance at the house. The second letter is, I thought was a really interesting one, because on the envelope over at Bowdoin was a note in Elizabeth's hand reading, at the Days in Damariscotta, first sight of the Ark and of our land, March 13th, 1931. And this is Henry from the letter. I've seen the Days Ark and had an afternoon of outdoor adventure which missed perfection only in that you were not here to share its joy. First we got into Jake's car with our lunch kits and snowshoes, motored some 5 miles due north along the state road, and left her at a corner grocery. We then faced a 5-mile walk over a side road scarcely broken out, a road climbing and descending 2 great hills from whose summits one could look over a great Maine wilderness wood to the Camden Mountains blue and white in the far air. Deep snow everywhere. That seems to be a pattern. 5 feet of it on the fields, and roadside drifts as high as my head. Heavy, water-cemented snow. Snow and space and woods. At the end of it a farm, an old couple with cheery blue eyes, a deep well in living rock, a grandfather clock, and a library of paper novels of the 1880 through 1890, can you forget her kind. Then across the most beautiful pine and beech and hemlock pasture to a slope in deep pines and hemlocks, then a cove, a dream of a cove, woods all around, no cottages, nothing but superb trees, old growth as they say here, an amphitheater of snow and towering green, the bush below buried deep, save for some outstruggled twig here and there, the floor of the cove, an untrodden stainless carpet of level snow. And then he goes on to talk about how that Jake had offered Henry and Elizabeth the use of the Day's Ark sometime that summer, which they took up that kind offer, and from there on it seems like it was inevitable that they were going to end us here. Oh, I'm sorry, yes, the Day's Ark was the Days family. They had basically a houseboat, the Ark, which was the Day's Ark. I mean,
That was on Lake Damariscotta, right?
And I'm going to skip around since I mentioned the Ark. This is one of my favorite stories that I dug up last summer. From a letter from August 18th, 1931. 3 stories. Jake speaks. Were you here, Henry, when we had the woodchuck aboard? We had one aboard for 3 days this summer. Do you remember this? Well, you'll see why in a few moments. We had one aboard for 3 days this summer. I was rowing in the cove and I saw him swimming across the cove. Lots of people don't know that they take to water. Well, I fished him out with an oar and got him into the boat, and there he sat under a seat, chattering and making his teeth go at me. We got him aboard and let him have the run of the ship. There's a little dramatic foreshadowing there. In 3 days, he would let me touch him, pat him on the back with my fingers. He was awfully funny with Rastus, the new black and white kitten. Rastus thought he ought to be more friendly, but the woodchuck wasn't sure what it was all about. Rastus would get right up close to him and hit him a biff on his face, and the woodchuck wouldn't pay any attention. Then Rastus would biff him again with the same result. Then Rastus would hit him a 3rd time, and still having no result, would go off to the end of the boat to think it over. One day we went away from the ark, and leaving the door open, he got in and acted like a cyclone. Never saw such a mess. He got up on the sink shelf and knocked off a lemon pie, and then fell off himself into the lemon pie. When we came back, he was sitting up on his haunches by the ruin of the lemon pie, licking off his little black forefeet, awfully cunning. The next day he jumped ship, took to the water again, and the woods. I wanted to leave plenty of time for other people to tell their stories, which is why I brought my tape recorder. But as a literary critic, I could not resist this one. This is from 1928. He wrote a letter to a friend of his from Cape Cod, a young man that Henry became close with, Truesdell Fife. And he writes to Truesdell, who is in high school and on his way to college. He says, "I agree with you heart and soul about the present study, in quotations, of literature. A great book is a work of art and is to be enjoyed as art. And it's just as much a vandalism to break it up into paragraphs, word sequences, and all that PhD fudge, as it would be to break the Venus of Milo with a sledgehammer and study the fragments. Not that I condemn literary study. Far from it. I know that a great work of art can be analyzed. But that is not what they do in the modern school. In the modern school, they dissect it, chopping text and author into tiresome little bits, making literary hamburger out of honest beef. If they should ever, in umpteen hundred years, get busy on me, quote, now children, today we will all read together the last paragraph of The Outermost House and write the vowel sequences on the blackboard. Truesdell, I'd give an enraged berserk yell that would trouble heaven, crawl under the earth again, revivify my bones, push up the clods of my grave, and appear at the Puddleberry Central High and raise, oh well, you know. So I feel like I am officially on notice with that particular letter. I have a couple others, but that's plenty. I want to get around to, well, in particular, I want to get around to the day's story because I hadn't met them before I came up, and they are so much a part of the Bestons and the Coatsworth's life that they've almost become major literary figures to me even before having met them.
So with that wonderful segue, I don't have to do any work. We'll just, yeah, thank you, Dan. Before we move on, I do want to point out that Daniel is the biographer, and he is looking for informants. So if any of you want to talk to him about Henry and have something to tell him about Henry or Elizabeth.
I brought contact information in case any of you are willing to share your stories. And I should say that Kate Barnes, who's been wonderfully helpful with this project, told me right from the get-go. She echoed Oliver Cromwell's words to his portrait painter. She said, warts and all, don't feel like you have to censor anything. So any stories are welcome.
So we'll make the move on to the Day family now, and Henry and Elizabeth have started coming up to Nobleborough because of Dick's father and the Rangers, and so we'll move on to Dick Day.
I think I shocked Gary when I showed him what I brought to talk about.
The next 2 hours will be Dick Day.
And I'm surprised he didn't talk about the porcupines we had on board. In fact, we had 3, I think, one time. Jake built a post in the back of in the stern of the houseboat, with a little perch on it. One of the porcupines lived in that perch. And one of the porcupines is buried on the point. A nice point out there. There's a little stone with porky carved on it. I have it in my lap. Yeah, you can hold a porcupine in the lap. Wow. Henry, I was born in 1920, at the time that my dad Jake was illustrating Henry's children's books, the Firelight Fairy Tale and Starlight Wonder Book. My daughter's sitting over there with a copy of it.
She's
moved.
We're behind the post, so we moved.
She's got a copy of each of them. She's going to add a little bit later. So they became very close friends. And Henry took a real shine to little baby Dickie when he was born. I've got a picture in our front yard in Amescata with Henry holding me in his arms when I was just an infant. And I am Richard Beston Day. Very proud of that. I think perhaps I might start just briefly about the outermost house. That is the thing that probably in the literary field made Henry really an icon. That was a great piece of work. It was his greatest achievement in all of his literature. And I have had the privilege of spending 2 weeks in the outermost house. Incidentally, it does not exist anymore. When Henry, he gave it to the Audubon Society, and not long after that, I think it was the hurricane of '78, took it out to sea. It was an adorable little place. And here's a picture that Jake drew. One picture at the top, and one at the bottom is a photograph of the outermost house. The thing I remember most about it was a delightful experience, but the thing that stands out in my mind the most is we had a wire-haired fox terrier with us at the time. She went out every day and rolled in the dead dogfish on the beach. I have a very clear memory. I don't think we ever got the odor completely out of it. But it was quite an experience. But that was Henry's crowning glory. That was a beautiful story. If you haven't read it, you certainly should. I have 3 copies of it that Henry, or one of the copies he gave my folks. But he, for Richard Beston Day, with all love from his namesake, Uncle Henry. Now, Henry was always Uncle Henry to the Day family, and Elizabeth was Aunt Betsy. We never knew them by anything else. And yes, Jake was responsible for Henry finding a farm. There were 3 farms. If you're familiar at all with East Neck, there are 3 farms on East Neck. The furthest one up was the girls' camp, Camp Macarita. Chimney Farms is next down, and then what was, when we were there, the Rollins Farm. Originally, I think George Dowie, he could probably tell me for sure, but I think they were all 3 were Hall farms.
Yes.
Probably
Chimney Farm was built by my great-great-grandfather.
Yeah.
Then
So
you
all 3 of those were Hall farms. Yeah. And it was the Rollins Farm, which was the first one you get to, where we bought our eggs and milk when we were up there. And they had a beautiful artesian well, and we drank their water. We had a spring down by the ark, but it tasted kind of woody, so we didn't use it much. And the houseboat was built in Damascotta Mills, at Lester Hall's mill. But the very next year, Lester Hall said, I know just where this ark ought to go, and he towed it up to Deep Cove. And it was in Deep Cove all the rest of his life. A houseboat is now gone. Henry and Betsy both love to visit there. But I've got something that Henry wrote when he visited the ark. And I think this may sound familiar to some of you because I think it's appeared in other things. But this is what Henry wrote in our log. You feel the whole page of the ark log. For Jake, B, Mac, and Dickie. I'll go with that. Okay. Hold your hand out over the earth and over a flame to all who love her, who open to her the doors of their veins. She gives us her strength, sustaining them with her own measureless tremor of dark light. Love the earth, honor the earth, rest your spirit in her solitary places. For the gifts of life are the earth's, and they are given to all, and they are the dawn and the first awakening songs of the birds. The swaying, delicate shadow of the hemlock branch upon the deep, new-fallen snow, and the far roar of ocean beyond the upland pastures and the pines. Henry Beston. Henry loved nature. And another thing that I am pleased about, that Barbara and I recently had an experience, and something Henry would appreciate. We just had a Passamaquoddy medicine man and his wife as guests at our house for 3 days this week. Henry loved their traditions and their way of life, and he would have been delighted to have met our friend Passamaquoddy, because he was very much into that. Mac and I used to go swimming with Henry, and Henry would show us how the Native Americans brushed themselves off after they swam with a fur bow in their towels. So Henry would give us each a fur bow and have us brush the water off. He liked this. Henry had a great sense of humor. In one of my letters, I've got lots of letters here which I won't have time to read. In one of them, had been over in Germany. And this is another thing, Henry was multilanguage. He spoke French quite fluently. He did speak some German. Some of the letters he wrote to me, if he was writing from Germany, he'd drift off into German in the letter. And if he was writing from France, he'd drift off into French in the letter. But he was talking about the beautiful complexion of the German people. And what a nice complexion he has. He said they don't look like the Americans, who look like a pork chop dipped in water. One time Boston Harbor was frozen over, and Henry sent my folks a telegram on the day that the harbor in Boston froze over. And the telegram simply read, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, the harbor was frozen, so they hung out all 3. That's all he said. So he was a delightful person. Henry introduced my folks to table tipping. He was very spiritual. Barbara and I belong to the Spiritualist Church, so we can relate to this. But I can remember as a child lying upstairs in bed, hearing them laughing and having a great time downstairs. Table tipping is a spiritualist process. The table, it does, believe me, it moves. And all you do is rest your fingers on it. And you go through some other ritual, but the table, it moves. It defies gravity. It's an incredible experience. But Henry introduced my folks to that. And now, Barbara and I, in our adults, were experiencing that phenomenon. And I can remember it as a child, and I thought, gee, that's weird. And now I see what they were doing. The outermost house was a very interesting experience because I was able to appreciate what Henry saw and how he lived there. And living on the Ark was a similar experience. Now, that's his book, Houseboat Summer, is Days Ark. In fact, the picture on the cover of the sheet is exactly as our houseboat looked. But Henry, Betsy fictionalized the story. Pure fiction as far as the characters. As she talks about East Neck and West Neck. She talks about Downscotta Lake. She mentions Deep Cove. She uses real names for the places. But the people in it are different. Mr. and Mrs. Rollins are now Mr. and Mrs. Putnam. And in the other houses she used other names. She used different names for the, she had a boy and a girl, a brother and a sister, rather than two Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer characters, which is what Mac and I were. But it follows a lot of what we did in some ways. The interior design that's shown in the inside of the book is pretty close to exactly as the Ark was inside. And it was built in the same dimensions as our huge kitchen in the White Day House on Bristol Road, where the shipyard workers from the shipyard ate their meals. And that's why our kitchen was so huge. And she talks about various experiences. One of the experiences with the kids in Houseboat Summer went up to help the Putnams do their haying. Mac and I went up and helped the Rollins do their haying. And what she describes in the Houseboat Summer of those kids doing is exactly what Mac and I did when we went up to help the Rollins. And this is a painting that my dad did of Mac and me helping Mr. Rollins get in the hay. I'm the one with the reins on the horse up in the front of the hay wagon. Mac's trampling the hay, and Mr. Rollins is pitching it up into the hay. And this is exactly as Elizabeth describes it in her book, only it's the boy and the girl doing it for the Putnams. So much of what Elizabeth put in there is from Days Out. I've got some stuff, some letters and things that Henry did that are quite different from what maybe some of you people think of Henry. He was very upset with some things going on in the world, and well, he was in World War I, but he not only detested war, as most anybody would anyway, he detested the damage caused by war and the aftermath of the war. Very concerned about after World War I and World War II, very concerned about rebuilding the material, the fabric of the town, and the destruction that occurred during the war, and that you could rebuild structures, you can't rebuild spirit and faith and hope. And this is sort of his great concern. He ended one article he wrote for the Human Events magazine. Charity is a first duty, but without the aid of faith and hope, charity alone will never carry the day. America cannot merely drop money with neglect, goodwill in the lap of a legless man and say, "Here, fellow, grow yourself 2 new legs." And he hit on this theme a lot in things he wrote, some of the letters he wrote. And I wonder how he would feel today with the situation that is in this country and worldwide. Henry would be very concerned. He was very concerned about the hypocrisy of the country, about the atom bomb. We don't want anybody else to have it. We'd like to have it ourselves. And he saw a lot of hypocrisy. You see, in fact, he called World War II, believe it or not, Henry called World War II an evil war and an evil peace. He didn't like the way all the negotiations took place at the end of it. And I know I know two things he talked about. One was the destruction of buildings. I was in Würzburg, Germany during the war, and the city of Würzburg was what I'd call a cathedral city, a beautiful city. The British, in a half an hour, with an incendiary saturation bombing, made that city look like Katrina. And Henry was concerned about Dresden. He called Dresden a massacre in one of his letters he wrote to me. And it's that rebuilding. I mean, you just don't realize what it does to family. We've been watching that show, Upstairs, Downstairs, the English series of the upper crust upstairs and the servants downstairs. In England, when they got bombed so heavily and hit so hard by the war, it wiped out that level of society. Why? It changed the whole structure of the society. And Henry talks a lot about rebuilding Europe. Well, they have done a fabulous job, but he's very concerned about what was destroyed historically. Just like in Iraq, they destroyed that museum. Iraq was known as the cradle of civilization, yet they destroyed that museum, pilfered a lot of the very valuable artifacts that were there. Some of them disappeared, they don't know where they're gone. Priceless historical material, gone. And this sort of thing upset Henry terribly. Any of this sort of thing. The destruction of history, the fabric of history. And he gets at that in his thing he wrote for Human Events. Since VE Day, our federal government has poured from its seeming horn of plenty billions more into rubble. Yet what we now call upon to face the crisis of Western civilization is to be noted that coincident with this crisis, the end of the horn of plenty begins to have a hollow sound, and that the national well-being is showing increasingly dangerous symptoms of a burden too great for economic health. And he used to preach this sort of thing, and he was very concerned about it. And I guess good reason. I can remember talk about an evil peace. I was in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia when the war ended. And just outside of town, there was a billboard the size of this wall. U.S. troops do not advance beyond this point. That billboard was already there the day the war ended, already in place. We had arranged that we would go no further. Russia had the next territory. So we stopped. And the German soldiers by the thousands were coming to surrender to us. The field was full of them, because they preferred coming to us than going there. It was interesting. And Henry touched on all these kinds of things, and he got very involved politically. A lot of people don't realize how politically Henry did get involved. I've got lots of nice letters I'd like to read. One of them is a cute letter about a chemise that he gave me, because he'd either grown too big or the chemise had grown too small. And he hoped I could use it. Another one, he just had his hair cut and his mustache shaved and trimmed. He says, "Clark Gable, you better look out." He said, "I didn't realize I was so handsome." He made cute little comments like that through his letters. They're delightful. I'd like to take the time to read them all to you, but I don't have the time. I'll get to some of this stuff later. I've got more on the outermost house. Incidentally, for those of you who want to pursue information on Cape Cod and the outermost house, there is a group in Boston that is developing the Henry Beston Society. There's a little book written by a fellow by the name of Don Wilding about Cape Cod and Henry. You're probably familiar with this. This is a delightful book. And there's one that's written by a lady by the name of Anne Turner Waldron, Journey to the Outermost House. This is an autographed copy she sent to me because I gave her some information. She has since passed away in year 2000 with cancer. But it's a delightful book, all about the outermost house. So there's wealth of information about Henry out there.
Question, isn't there, well, both of you would be able to answer this, but isn't there sort of a cult movement now on Henry Beston in the Massachusetts and New England area?
This outfit's doing quite well.
Yeah, I just know from people coming into the shop that several of them are in this area just because they want to see where he walked. That kind of thing.
There's quite a bit of interest.
And do you think that will keep growing and increasing?
I think so, yeah.
When Daniel's book comes out.
20 years from now.
20 years from now. Well,
Oh, no, you can't do that.
I want to add just a note is that the Henry Beston Society had applied to the National Park Service. They wanted to rebuild the outermost house within federal lands on where the outermost house used to be. This week they were denied, and one of the points that the Park Service made was that if they rebuilt it where the outermost house had been, it would have to be on pontoons because that was now underwater. But so they're still hoping to go ahead and rebuild a model of it, but outside of the federal lands. So they're now looking for another place to build it.
There's a new website too, some folks up at Syracuse University have put together, which is an excellent website, a good resource. Although Gary and I were laughing before because they very kindly mentioned that I was writing an autobiography. I didn't realize I was channeling. I thought I was doing research.
Gary, Drusilla has something she'd like to say, Brooke. Can I call on her briefly just to say?
If it's okay with Patty, since Patty's Drusilla.
I promise to not take much time because I know that there are other people who want to talk. You're not Betsy. So these are a couple of the books, plus the Chimney Farm bedtime stories, which I saw there are copies of there. And this is a book signing of the Chimney Farm bedside stories that is Uncle Henry, Aunt Betsy, and Pappy, my grandfather. So I just thought that was a neat.
Where was it?
It was at the Main Coast Bookshop when it was, who just asked that question? Who am I looking at?
I did.
Oh, yeah, I see. The Main Coast Bookshop when it was on the other side of the
remember that.
street, the smallest shop when you and Walker owned it.
Right.
So I thought that was a neat picture. And the other thing, just real quickly, is that I was very privileged to spend a lot of time with Aunt Betsy because I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. And we oftentimes went out to the farm or Aunt Betsy would come to the house. But there's one occasion in particular that I just remember very well. And we were having tea in Aunt Betsy's garden. And I don't remember how old I was, but little. And I was just fascinated by Aunt Betsy because she was just sort of this bigger than life person to me. And we were sitting around and she was drinking her tea with her little finger crook. So I'm trying to crook my finger. And she noticed that. So she helped me crook my finger. So to this day, when I drink a cup of tea, I have my little finger crooked, just like Aunt Betsy taught me. I just wanted to share that. So, thank you.
By the way, these are the two books that Jake was illustrating when he and Henry got together. And at the time I was born.
And we have, as Priscilla mentioned, we have just republished Chimney Farm Bedtime Stories with Jake Day's artwork. And the proceeds from that edition of that book go to the Damariscotta Lake Watershed Association's efforts to pay for the conservation easements. And in May, we'll be republishing an edition of Northern Farm with the same deal as a fundraiser for the DLWA's move to save the farm. And what better use to put those
It's an
books
excellent book.
yeah, and I would also recommend, if you're interested in Henry's war experiences, Henry has a book called A Volunteer Poilu, and it's not like any other Henry Beston book. It's a very, very gruesome, harsh account of his time as an ambulance driver on the front lines in France in World War I. Because Henry spoke fluent French, when he went over, he was put right on the front lines. And what he describes is so ugly and just so harsh that it makes me wonder if going to the outermost house wasn't necessary for Henry's mental health. I mean, it's sort of a post-traumatic stress disorder, kind of coming back from seeing this horrible, horrible thing and moving as far away from the city as he could to a place where he was almost literally by himself with the elements. It's a really wonderful book. There were a number of Harvard undergraduates who were urged by a particular professor to go over and be ambulance drivers in the war, and the Volunteer Poilu is pretty much unknown. It's actually, the whole text is on the web. You can actually read it on the internet because it's not a print book.
Gary, the gal who wrote this book, her father was a classmate of Henry's at Harvard. And also another thing is that Henry and T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost are only three that have received Medal of Honor from one of the literary societies. So he ranks up with the best.
Well, now we'll segue from Drusilla to Patty. Earlier this winter, I received this wonderful letter in the mail. And on the outside it said it was from the Wayside Tea Room, so I had some idea that it was going to be an interesting letter. And we give directions sometimes to people, but look for the geese on the lawn, and you're almost there. But
Well, this is a hard act to follow, these two, so I'm the lighter part. I'm the ice cream of the
dessert.
Anyway, Gary had written to me when I was in California asking me if I would read the letter, and I thought, well, that was kind of a nice compliment, and I said, sure. So tonight I said, Gary, did you bring the letter? He said, no, bring it. So I'm not sure I can remember everything that was in the letter, but as you remember, Gary put out a call to everybody to write down their memories of Chimney Farm, and I thought it was a wonderful thing that he was doing, and how nice to preserve that from those that would remember. And so it took me a long time, actually, from the time that you put out the first notice, I think, and I finally, before I went to California, I said, I've got to do this, because I might die on the way to California, flying. And so, anyway, it was kind of interesting, and I did have some very fond memories of going to Chimney Farm. I used to go everywhere with my father when I was a little girl, and I don't know whether it was he wanted me with him or it was my mother didn't want me in the house, probably the latter. But I always went with my dad, and he was a great one for talking. I can't imagine if I inherited that. He loved to go around the countryside and talk to farmers and talk to this one and talk to that one. All very boring for a little girl. So luckily I like to read. So I always carried books with me in the car, and would sit in the car while my father would talk. And we'd go over to the Chimney Farm, and he and Henry would get into these very deep, serious conversations. Very, very boring. And they were talking about the war, the environment, how to farm. Because my father, too, was an environmentalist and was very interested in what was going to happen to the future of Maine, and with all the people that were coming in, and good heavens, 50 years ago there weren't that many coming in, but he thought it was a tremendous amount. And such things as topsoil, and my father was a beekeeper, and Henry was terribly interested in bees, as I remember. So anyway, I would just go hide somewhere and read my book, but when Mrs. Beston was home, she would rescue me. And she would bring me into the kitchen and serve me cookies and milks, and I thought she was just wonderful to do that. And sometimes she would let me go into the library and go through all the books, and I just loved books. And to me, that was heaven, just going through all these books. And, you know, I didn't know they were famous people. I didn't know they were authors or anything, although I'm sure my father kept telling me, but it didn't make much difference. And as a matter of fact, he would give me books by Elizabeth and tell me, you know, that they were Mrs. Beston's, and I could never understand that, because why were they Mrs. Beston's when that said Elizabeth Coatsworth? That did not make sense to me. And so, anyway, she would rescue me, and one of the things that I particularly remembered is that we would walk down through the fields, and she loved to pick flowers. I don't know if you remember that, but she loved wild flowers and had them everywhere. And she would always pick these flowers and ask me what the name of it was, and did I know how the seeds went, you know. And we would just gather all these flowers and take them back to the house and arrange them in these wonderful bouquets. And sometimes we would go down to the houseboat and just sit there and watch the loons or whatever. I wasn't particularly impressed with boats, because everybody had a boat. Or it seemed to me everybody had a boat. And a houseboat, you know, knew something. And so but that was one of the things. And then to carry on with Elizabeth, when I went to California, became a teacher, one of the requirements as a teacher, I'd make my children read the Newbery Award books. And I would always start out with A Cat Who Went to Heaven, which was Elizabeth's claim to fame, and read it. It was a little book, so you could read it to the class. And then I would read letters that Elizabeth had written me, and so that made it really close to the children and gave them a reason to read it. You know, like, here are two people from a little town in Maine. And of course, most of my children had never heard of Maine. It was like, what state is that in? And she just, yeah, and she was always very neat, very perfectly covered. You know, her hair was always nice, you know, sort of like mine. And she just absolutely was a lady through and through, a very English lady. And in a hurricane, well, the day after a hurricane, which is appropriate. And we didn't have any electricity. I can't remember, Hurricane Carol maybe was it the big one, 1954? And all of my guests were coming from like Boston and New York and that sort of thing, because I went to college out of state. They couldn't get in. They couldn't get into the state. They had to go up around Bangor and come in that way. They couldn't come in through Damascotta, which is kind of interesting. But the next day, as always after a big storm, it was absolutely to die for beautiful. And everybody showed up for the wedding, even though there was no electricity. And this is one of the pictures that was taken at the wedding. And it's Henry, very dapper with his hat. He always had that hat on. And I'm giving him a piece of the wedding cake. But he sat in this chair all during the wedding and shook everybody's hand. And a lot of my guests thought he was my father, because he was very proper, you know, as, you know, a father should be. But my father was running around chasing me and wondering, what's going on? But this was Henry, and the wedding present.
Henry Cooper Dodge, and my husband here, Calvin. But when back in '43, when we moved to where we live now, that summer, my mother thought she would have a gift shop in the house, and it was a spinning wheel at that time. Well, different times she'd be cooking, and we'd hear the door open, and somebody come in, and all of a sudden we'd hear this man say, "What are you cooking, Kathleen? What you got cooking out there?" And he he loved her pickles, canned pickles. He'd go along, the cover up, and smell them, and look them over. And then different times they belonged to the Grange together. He'd call and say, Winfield, there's a Grange meeting in Augusta or wherever. You and Kathleen get ready and we'll all go. And he'd come to the barn and talk with my folks and come in the house. And so one day I happened to be knitting argyles. And he said, I'd like to have a pair of argyles. So he was my one customer that every other thing, you got another pair of argyles done. And then just before he died, or it might have been a year or two, I can't remember, but he said, I've got a strange request. I'd like to have you knit me an argyle handkerchief. I said, Henry? Yes. He said, I'm going to fold it and put it in my pocket. But in the meantime, I can't remember what really happened, but I never did get it done. But we used to
knit argyles. She kept on knitting them for me when I married her. And I have some that's over 40 years old now. So I can understand why Henry Weston liked her argyle socks, because they are comfortable and warm. This winter we was going through a lot of items, and Margie said to me, you know, we can't leave all that mess to our son. He's got to go up in the attic or the storeroom and just reminisce and go through all these items. So I was going through one of Winfield Cooper's items from the Nobleboro Grange. And I looked at it and I started chuckling it, and I said, no, I got to read that over, Marjorie, and then you read it. And she chuckled as well. And this is a letter that was written by Ed Winfield. Grange supper as seen by E.R. Kastner. It's nice to mingle with you good old friends, our customers, mixed up with generations and in the middle class people. By gory, I took my girl up to Nobleboro Grange the other night. We had a $4 supper for 75 cents. That brought back a little chuckle when I first read that. We got down to the first table. There was a judge there from Alabama. He tried to keep up with two husky boys eating, but he failed. Henry Beston had for his guest a woman named Coatsworth. They say they were writers. Well, it seemed good to be with writers. I never had much time.
Deep cove on land.